Today I'm going to be taking a look at Pretty Maniacs, a manga by Kurihashi Shinsuke Sensei. This is kind of an interesting series because it's one of those that pretty much nobody has read or heard about. It's extremely difficult to find information about online, and it was published by a strange distributor who, I mean, they do distribute manga, but most people haven't heard of them. That would be Comics One. The reason I want to talk about Pretty Maniacs is because it's secretly a sequel, well, maybe not so secretly, a sequel to Maniac Road. This is another manga that I have talked about before in my Once Upon a Time in Akihabara or the Grand Otaku drama, that blog where I compared Maniac Road and Sotaku no Akihabara Funtoki slash I Otaku, two similar otaku manga that I read around the same time, and I thought it was interesting to weave a narrative between the two. So, Maniac Road was a fairly unremarkable manga when it was all said and done. It did have the initial allure of being a manga about otaku and otaku culture during a very specific period of time, as well as being set within a fictional shop in Akihabara, which sounds quite compelling if you ask me. That's the reason why I picked it up. But then actually going through it wasn't that exciting of a story, and it kind of meandered a lot. It didn't really go anywhere. Pretty much the reason why I continued reading this manga was because it was A, about otaku culture, and B, the main character. I guess he's the main character. His name is Takezo. He's the one on the cover right there with the trench coat. He sort of embodied this potential character that was quite prevalent around the time within like otaku archetypes and stuff, that you would see this character a lot. Tencho being like the main character for the Gainax commercials that were made for anime, which was this like larger than life sort of badass bancho, a shop owner that would like do battle, and he's like this hot blooded, like testosterone, like levels off the chart kind of badass dude. And that's kind of what like a certain archetype of otaku was being developed around the time. You don't really see it too much these days, but at the time it was in vogue, I guess. It was seen more often than I would expect. So I kind of noted it as like a at least somewhat of an archetype. But regardless, that was Takuzo, the protagonist, I guess. And the reason why I say he was kind of the protagonist is because while he was the one of the primary characters, like he was introduced initially, it kind of came off across as like this guy is going to be the main character. As the story progressed, he started to fade into the background, I guess, more as like this enigma, more so than an actual character with like, you know, a personality or anything. He kind of existed as an idea, kind of off in the background. It was kind of strange. It was just kind of interesting to see him kind of come onto the screen, so to speak, or come onto the page in this case, and kind of be a mouthpiece for the mangaka himself, and like talk about battleships and, you know, plastic models and whatever the mangaka Kurihashi Sensei was into at the time. So that kind of gets you up to speed with Maniac Road. The manga was only 3 volumes long. Right here is the final volume. It was published in English by Comics One, and it just sort of ends on sort of a cliffhanger. Takuzo is going to go to America. He's going to continue Maniac Road. There was another like broccoli stand-in company. Broccoli being like the people who created DG Shade in real life. I forgot what they called them. And the manga kind of ends on a slight cliffhanger, but it was one that I didn't necessarily think deserved or really needed a follow-up, I guess. So in comes Pretty Maniacs. I found out about this during the research stage, late research stage, I should specify, during my blog and video about these two manga, Maniac Road and Sotakun. And it was too interesting of a find to pass up. So I went on eBay, I found someone selling all 3 volumes, and I picked them up fairly cheap. Because it's not really a manga that I think many people even know exists, I guess, because it's a sequel to a manga that people probably don't even know exists to begin with. It's also a sequel that I'm almost certain that literally nobody asked for. It just kind of appeared. It's more so a spin-off than an actual sequel in the truest sense. But it is kind of interesting to look at, and I want to take a quick look at it today. Now that all the background is out of the way, what is Pretty Maniacs? So, Pretty Maniacs is another 3 volume manga, fairly formulaic in terms of following the footsteps of what Maniac Road was, but it does have its own appeal to it, and it might actually be better than Maniac Road in some regards. Perhaps maybe not as memorable, but maybe more of an enjoyable read in a conventional sense. So the main character is the girl on the front cover with the beret. I think that's what it is, a beret, the little hat, called Shinano, and she comes from the countryside into Tokyo and starts attending a high school. And the first thing she does is join the manga club, or at least she wants to restart the manga club because at this school the manga club is initially, kind of in limbo because there's not enough members to it. It's a fairly, fairly traditional setup in terms of like characters get restarting a club that has been forgotten kind of premise. But this character, she's actually the little sister of Takuzo. It's not really important that she's the little sister of Takuzo. It kind of is just a fact that's thrown in there, kind of to relate these stories, because without that detail, there really wouldn't be much of a connection to Maniac Road. There are a few inconsequential recurring characters. Shinano does stay above the shop in Akihabara at Maniac Road, like the store, like, they have apartments above. But other than that, the actual connections between the two are so inconsequential that it doesn't really matter. This could have been something completely differently, or it could, you can kind of pick this up without having read Maniac Road and still kind of get the idea of what the story is, because it stands alone and it does tell a pretty interesting story. So, like I said, it does kind of come off as fairly routine stuff with like characters restarting a club, but I think it does have a bit of a it does have a bit of an appeal to it that a lot of other manga sort of promise but never really deliver in a sense, in this specific sense, because the characters of the manga club, once they get enough members and once people start like joining and stuff and we have more established characters, they start creating doujinshi, and they release their stuff at like Comic Cat in, I think just basically just Comic Cat, but they make doujinshi. There are multiple characters within the club who have the ability to draw, or they just like making manga. It's just a club for otaku, and it's interesting. And like at a certain point, there was an all girls school, I believe, and an all boys school, and they merged. And there was 2 manga clubs, and now they're kind of working together. And you have the guy side and the girl side, and you kind of see how they like bump heads sometimes. Never really in a meaningful way of creating conflict, but just kind of just there as a detail, I guess. It's just part of the background, just in the periphery. But the reason I say this is kind of interesting because Maniac Road didn't really attempt to do anything like that, and neither did Sotaku no Akihabara Funtoki. Another manga about otaku culture that needs no introduction is Genshiken, and Genshiken does touch on this a bit. Some of the characters do go to Comic Cat, especially later on in Nidaime, where there is more of a, I guess, quote unquote focus of it. Like it's never really like what the manga is about. It's more about otaku culture and evolved more into like about people who are into otaku culture, less about otaku culture. But there still is that doujinshi aspect, since that's intrinsic to what it means to be an otaku in like the events that otaku attend. And Maniac or Pretty Maniacs uniquely like focuses on this in a way that I don't really see other series do, and like it commits to it. It's a manga about people in a manga club, and they actually create doujinshi, and it's not really about much else. It's kind of interesting. It doesn't really get too in depth with like what is the process of making doujinshi. There is a bit about like the hand, like the handcrafted nature of doujinshi, actually binding the books yourself, which is cool. And then they use like the school's resources to do that, and when they didn't have permission. So there is a bit of that to it, and in that sense, it reminds me a lot of Comic Party, which is another series. This one is the manga version, but it was originally a Bishoujo game developed by Leaf. And this one is, it's half about doujinshi, also half about like Bishoujo game antics and stuff like that. But this one is another series that kind of gets into the nitty gritty about what it means to make doujinshi. Unfortunately, neither Comic Party nor Pretty Maniacs really gets like in the weeds of what it means to create doujinshi in a way like Bakuman does for manga or Shirobako does for anime. I think it is valuable to see that insight, especially as someone who, especially like written by a mangaka who had previously written and still continues to write doujinshi, which in the little corners at the end of each chapter, Kurihashi Sensei does mention things like, what he's working on and stuff, and like in terms of plastic models, occasionally he's like, "Oh, I worked on this doujinshi right here," and he mentions some of the colleagues that he's worked with and made connections over time that he knew from the doujinshi days and still contributes to doujinshi. So I think that's really interesting to see that perspective, I guess, or at least a story woven by someone with that understanding in mind. Especially like Kurihashi comes across as someone who is very much of an old guard otaku, into like the battleships and the plastic models and the handmade doujinshi, as opposed to like in Genshiken the characters just send their books off to the printing press, whereas in Pretty Maniacs they use like a printing machine in the school and then they use the glue and bind all the books together by hand. Like everybody is involved with the process, so it's more of a like a zine type of thing, which is how they translate it in the manga. So the story just spans three volumes. It doesn't really go anywhere, and that's I guess my problem with it. It doesn't leave as much of an impression, and it doesn't really have too much of a like a narrative through line, I guess, like something to follow. Like in Maniac Road, there was Takazo, who was the main character, like who we were focusing on, and we kind of were interested in seeing how he could build up Maniac Road to be like the best otaku store in Akihabara. And like while it does, not necessarily always follow that narrative, in a sense, like it does still commit to it by the end. And Pretty Maniacs doesn't necessarily do that. It's more of like a slice of life thing with characters in the manga club. They create doujinshi, they kind of hang out, and there's not really much else to the story, I guess. And there also are a lot of characters, and some of them like enter and exit in weird ways. That it doesn't really feel like you get to know the characters, partially because of how long they are in story, also because the manga is too long, so you never really get a good grasp of who these people are, and also because Kurihashi just isn't that good of a storyteller. Unfortunately, he can introduce interesting characters, but I don't really think they have any like meaningful dialogue and meaningful interactions with each other. It's just all kind of there. You're mostly reading this manga because it's about otaku. There are, some quirky bits to it. I think it's kind of fun. Shinano like is a quirky character in and of herself, but I don't think she has as much of a draw as Takazo does, who is more of a he has a certain gravity to him when he's on screen or on the page. Maybe not like a significant gravity, but like he comes on and you kind of want to pay attention to him. And with Shinano, she just kind of is a little bubbly. She kind of pops on and kind of does something, and that's really about it. It's a very inconsequential story. Not to say it's not interesting. It's just kind of there. Not very memorable though. Another interesting part about Pretty Maniacs is what it touches on within otaku culture. Like you see things that Maniac Road didn't necessarily talk about. Pretty Pretty Maniacs is much more of like an Akiba K kind of version of what otaku culture is circa this era of like 2003, 4, 5 ish. Whereas Maniac Road is more of like a classic otaku take, more of like what Otaku no Video was, where you kind of see like characters who are into Gundam and plastic models and whatnot. There is some stuff about video games and maids and figures and stuff, but it's not from the same place as like what Pretty Maniacs does, which is a little bit more of like what Genshiken was trying to do. So you see characters who attend like a Seiyu like event, characters they go to Akihabara, it's kind of stuff like that. I think there's a different perspective that's given coming from Kurihashi, who doesn't necessarily like seem to be involved as much within this side of the otaku culture, but there's a bit of a dialogue that happens, I guess, a sharing of information, if you will. But otherwise, that's basically it. Pretty Maniacs, 3 volumes. It kind of ends where it began. it would be nice to see a little bit more of it, but I'm not necessarily craving more of it. Interestingly enough, the manga does end on a cliffhanger. Takuzo just appears at the end and he's like, "I'm back," and then the manga ends, sort of leaving the doors open for another sequel that nobody asked for, like completely contrived. I mean, the manga does end in a good spot. Like, the characters, they're all kind of getting along now. They're all in the same manga club. There's a random foreign lady who shows up, and she's not like what's her name in Genshiken. The one other exchange student in Genshiken, her name's escaping me. It's cool to see all these diverse characters, like, kind of come together within this club, and I really wish that more attention was given to them, but because it wasn't, like I said, I don't really think I need more of this story. Overall, Pretty Maniacs was a decent manga. I don't necessarily think I would recommend it unless you're really into otaku manga, specifically like learning about otaku culture by way of manga, or you have read Maniac Road and you kind of want to see more of it, and you don't mind the idiosyncrasies of Kurihashi Sensei's manga writing. Between the two, Maniac Road and Pretty Maniacs, I might recommend Pretty Maniacs more just because it's good as a standalone series. It has more of an appeal from just a straight, like, slice of life kind of point of view. It's kind of quaint. It's a little cute. There's some parts where it's not that interesting. There's some jokes that just don't land, plot threads that don't go anywhere. But taken on the whole, stacked up against a lot of other otaku manga and otaku meta narratives and stuff like that, I think it's cool that something like this exists, because unfortunately there are not too many manga about otaku culture or anime about otaku culture. You could conceivably and very reasonably read and watch all of these without much effort, I guess. Like, there's not that many. It's not like I'm gonna watch all the isekai or I'm gonna watch every fantasy anime. With otaku culture focused series, there's a very limited amount, and Pretty Maniacs is certainly not the worst within these. It would be worth a look for someone who is interested, I'd say. And it's something that really isn't talked about too much. I don't really have any other platform, or I guess like a I don't know, like an excuse to talk about it other than just making one of these videos where I talk about it while sitting on the floor randomly and kind of aimlessly. It's cool that it exists. That's it. Like, and that fact that it was localized in the United States, translated to English, and released officially. Like, that's just so strange that this really unknown manga with under 1,000 people who have added it on myanimelist.net has an official release. And for that reason alone, it might be worth a look, especially if you're into obscure shit. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. Yeah, it's a mysterious manga for sure, but it's not a bad one. Something that unfortunately was lost to time, for better or for worse, was the unknown sequel to Maniac Road.